Hello, Cynthia. Great to chat. Thank you for coming on to have a chat. I really enjoyed our podcast on your podcast, and we've connected. And yeah, everybody wants to know about fasting for women. So you've literally written a book on it, which is yet to be released. But
Yeah.
it'd be great to get your thoughts and those insights. So, just as a backstory, how did you become passionate about intermittent fasting, and how did you get into this?
Well, it's a great question. And thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to our conversation. I think it really stemmed from the N of one. So many of us
Mm,
try a strategy out on ourselves, and then we're like, this might actually be applicable to more than just me. And so
mm,
I'm a middle-aged woman. I felt like I kind of got stuck in my early 40s. I'd never struggled with my weight, never struggled with energy, never struggled with, food cravings or anything. And it seemingly overnight it crept over me, and I was like, okay, what I'm doing is not working. So let's try something different. So it really was that kind of inspirational. It was like, okay, let me try something different. And almost instantaneously, I felt so much better, because what's the conventional wisdom we share with our
mm.
patients is that you need to eat meals frequently, you need to have snacks, etc. And yet that wasn't working for me and for most, if not all of my patients. So it started with me, and then I started to realize that maybe this might be a strategy that would be effective for a lot of the females that were coming to work with me. By that point, I had left clinical medicine
Yep.
in 2016 because I felt compelled to focus on things other than writing prescriptions. And so really focused on food. And from there stemmed group programs and one-on-one work with clients. Uh, and then it grew to being blogging about it, talking about it on social media, and then ultimately doing a couple TED Talks. And I think the funny story is, obviously, when you do a TED Talk, you can't do a second TED Talk on the same topic. And I had a very short turnaround time. I had to make a decision. Did I want to do a second? And if so, what was
Wow.
I going to talk about? And I remember saying to my husband, what do I know a lot about? And he was like, oh, intermittent fasting. And I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about intermittent fasting. And that was as organic as it could have been. And
Wow.
the organizers asked me to do a female slanted talk on intermittent
Yep.
fasting. So I did that to oblige them. They said, we have a lot of individuals that really want a women's health focused speaker.
Mm,
And so that began that journey down that rabbit hole, not realizing that talk would be what most people, when they think about, me or my business, that's now what they associate me with. And I think the biggest challenge for women, especially really dependent on what stage of life they're in. Are they at their
mm,
fertile years? Are they in perimenopause, the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause? Or are they in menopause? We all have to look at intermittent fasting from a different lens
mm.
in order to honor the wonderful bio-individuality we have as this gender.
Yeah.
And so that's really where it started from. It was that simple, but inspired action with regard to myself, really wanting to um, just do something different. I just felt like if the normal thing that I'm doing, because I was one of those people who went to the gym and I'd have a protein shake and run out to the gym, and I have a protein shake after, and I was having, mini meals if I was in clinic, and then maybe having a protein bar in between patients if I was in the hospital, because sometimes you didn't get the opportunity to stop and eat.
Mm,
And I thought, this is not working anymore. This is not
mm.
serving me. I don't buy into the fact that we have to accept weight gain as a normal function of aging. I just kept hearing that from people over and over and over again. And that frankly made me angry. I was like, I don't want that to be the case.
I want to find another way, a better way that works for me.
Exactly. And so now I intellectually can explain how that happens for a lot of
Mm,
people beyond just eating too much and not exercising and not getting good quality sleep. There's a lot of things that change in our bodies as we get older, which
mm.
stink, but there's ways around it. So
You
that's how
can
that started.
you can work with it. Yeah, it's funny. Like some of my now best friends, weirdly, are older ladies who have had success with data-driven fasting in the masterclass, and some of the people who've had the most amazing success are that older female demographic, who have done amazingly well. But then at the same time, you hear all these stories of, it's harder post-menopause to lose weight, and fasting is more difficult. And Dave Asprey's come out and said, I think a lot of people have caught the idea that, you shouldn't fast for too long as a female. And so where are the limits of fasting for women? What makes women different?
Mhm.
Why is it harder to fast or lose weight as you get older, particularly as a female?
Yeah, there's a
Big
lot.
question, I know, but
No. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So I think a lot of it's dependent on where we are chronologically. And so if you're under the age of 35, one of the things that makes you very unique is that we have the ability to procreate and carry life. And so
mm,
our bodies are particularly attuned to stressors. And we think about fasting as a great example of a hormetic stress, along with things
mm,
like high intensity interval training and cold exposure. And too much of any one thing can tell our body we're in a period of time where we're in danger. And sometimes you can't differentiate fasting too long from cold
mm,
exposure, from famine. I mean, all those things. And so I like to remind people that when we're looking at women in their peak fertile years, their bodies are much more sensitive to nutrient depletion. They're much more
mm,
sensitive to over fasting. And so that's the first kind of crux that I see is if you're under the age of 35, you have to fast differently than a middle-aged woman. And I'm going to say perimenopause, 35, depending on where you fall, women's, estradiol and testosterone and progesterone really start to change and flux as they get closer to 40. And so when women are in their 40s, I remind them that all the lifestyle pieces that in your 20s and 30s, you're invincible. It doesn't matter
mm,
how little you sleep. It's less of an issue in terms of your stress management, your nutrition. You just become much more inflamed.
mm,
That maybe you did fine with in your 20s and 30s, you get into your 40s and 50s. And I'm thinking about the big ones like gluten and grains and dairy as just one example. There's
mm,
many others. Your body's just much more susceptible to those things. So if you are adding in intermittent fasting in your perimenopause or early menopause years and you can't sleep through the night, again, we talk about this hormetic stress. It's too much for our body. Our
mm,
bodies are just not as resilient. And yes, that stinks. I don't like saying to anyone, my body is less resilient in my 40s than it was in my 20s and 30s, but that's a fact. And a lot of
yeah,
that is hormonally mediated. And so, I think about quality of your stress management. And yes, you cannot be doing CrossFit 5-6 days a week in your 40s and 50s and beyond. You have to be lifting weights in order to counteract some of the changes that go on in
mm,
our bodies. You need to get that high quality sleep. And if you're waking up multiple times a night, don't add intermittent fasting. And this is something I've really been very vocal about, that if you can't get the sleep dialed in, don't add in another stressor.
yeah,
The
yeah,
nutrition piece is, and I'm sure you see this,
yeah,
we're a culture that is very kind of hedonistic, very pleasure oriented, and eating for pleasure is different from eating for nutrition or for fuel. And so
mm,
I think a lot of people, it's differentiating, and you talk about this quite a bit, which I love about your work. What's true intrinsic hunger? What does that feel like? What is our blood
mm,
sugar doing when that happens? Because we've
mm,
gotten so disconnected. We kind of wake up and think it's 8 a.m., it's time to eat breakfast. It's 12 o'clock, it's time to eat lunch. It's 6 o'clock at night, it's time to eat dinner. Oh, I got to have a snack before I go to bed because I want to stoke my metabolism.
mm,
But back to, the middle age piece, I think that perimenopause is a very unique time. I remind women that I think of perimenopause as the years that are reminding us how well we're taking care of ourselves. So if you are managing your sleep and managing your stress and eating high quality, nutrient dense foods and not over exercising, and you have healthy relationships,
mm,
whether it's with the opposite sex or your loved ones, and you are spiritually and occupationally fulfilled, you're going to navigate heading into menopause a whole lot easier. And menopause is
mm,
defined as 12 months without a menstrual cycle.
mm,
And then I think of menopausal women in many ways as more akin to men because we don't have as much hormonal fluctuation
yep,
as cycling women do, women who are still getting their menstrual cycle. And so when I think about menopausal women, if they can get everything right, meaning if they can dial in on the lifestyle things that I've just alluded to, I think they can have incredible success with intermittent
mm,
fasting, but it requires getting really honest with yourself.
mm,
And, the one thing that I see, and this is not a criticism of my traditional Western medicine trained peers, but the mindset with most methodologies with hormone replacement, whether it's for men going through andropause, and yes, men go through andropause, women go through menopause. The mindset is just replace the hormones, that will fix the problems. No,
Yeah.
it doesn't. You really have to do the work. And then
Yeah.
if you've done all the work and everything's fallen into place and you still need hormonal therapy, there's no shame in that.
Yeah.
So I think to your initial question, what makes us unique are these cycling hormones until we go through menopause. And, one thing I'm also pretty outspoken about is that women can cycle, they can cycle. Women obviously cycle till they no longer cycle. But when they are a week prior to their period, I generally ask them to stop fasting, that's a time that, women will say, I just don't have the ability to do long fast the week before my period. My cravings are through the roof. I just don't feel good. And so I oftentimes will encourage women not to fast 5 to 7 days prior to their cycle. And with that caveat, there are 3 other weeks out of the month where most women can fast, or if you're really young, like if you're 25, 30, 35, a couple days a week. I don't think necessarily everyone needs to do these really long fasts. It might be the people are really working on digestive rest, or I have some younger women that are in their early 30s, and what we agree to is they fast 3 or 4 days a week. They monitor their menstrual cycle, they monitor their energy, they're really kind of clued in. And I tell them all the time that our menstrual cycle is a barometer. If it changes, goes away, and you're not pregnant more than a cycle or two, it's a sign that your body may, in fact, perceive that fasting is too much stress. So just really being honest. And I think, unfortunately, because women are women, there's not as much research done on women. There's a lot of research done on rodent models and obese menopausal women. And then there's a lot of, and I know we've kind of talked about this in Facebook groups, but and in between, there's a lot of conjecture. Like there's a lot of assumption, like, oh, well, if fasting overtaxes a mouse, then we're going to extrapolate the same thing happens to females. And I'm like, well, our reproductive systems are very different. We're both mammals, correct? We may both have the female gender, but you can't extrapolate the stress that would be impacted upon a rodent model per se, and say that this is applicable to all women that are getting a menstrual cycle. So I'm curious if that's been, have you been in your groups, because now you have these really big groups, you're seeing that women seem to feel a little bit more stuck with fasting than men?
Yes and no. I suppose I see a lot of people who fail with the extended multi-day OMAD, ADF. They sort of come in and go, I stalled out. And it seems that because the biology is so protective of being able to procreate, if you push it too hard, like you say, if you push that hormetic stress off the cliff, the body goes, whoa, I can't do this anymore. I've got to protect enough body fat so that we can still procreate. So there seems to be a balance point. But as you say, if you get the nutrition piece dialed in, you can then move the other pieces. It's been amazing. Like we've spent 5 years trying to tell people how to eat better and dial in the nutrition. But when we started talking about fasting, everybody came running and they want to learn how to not eat, but maybe still eat what they were eating before. It's much harder to change what you do eat than, just not eating. But it never seems to work when you don't prioritize what you do eat when you do eat. And if you don't get that dialed in, the cravings and the hunger and the rebound is just, leads to failure and disappointment and this rebound, binge, restrict cycle, which I think is a complete setup for, I don't know, lots of bad things. So it's nice when people just find that balance with data-driven fasting to balance that intermittent fasting. So my question back to you is like, what do you find? I know you don't recommend the extended fasting or ADF or even OMAD for most people. What do you see when people push it too long, too hard?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the things that I see, and this is always like the check-in point when I'm working with women. How's your energy? How's your sleep? Those are the two like cruxes. If your sleep's dialed in and you have plenty of energy, it's great. So the opposite would be the case. I've got a woman who keeps DMing me on Instagram and she keeps telling me the same story. And I said, you can't fast that long. If you get 18 and you're great, and then you push it to 20 and you can't sleep, what does that tell you? Your body's saying it's too much. So I would say it starts with insomnia. It starts with worsening, waking up at night. Oftentimes when I see people doing those long fasts, they're thinking if a little bit of fasting is good, then a lot of fasting is better. I
Yeah.
just remind them, I'm
Yeah.
like, our bodies don't work that way.
Yeah.
It really is a fine tune. It's like it's a very delicate dance trying to figure that out. So I'd say first and foremost, sleep disturbances, obviously energy issues. If people are getting dizzy, if they're lightheaded, if they're fatigued, if they try to go do a workout and they feel like they feel almost like they've got a virus
Mm.
going on. They just don't have the energy to get through a workout. I'm like, you need to check in with yourself.
Yeah. You need to eat something.
Exactly. Or, there's someone the other day, one of my groups, we were having a private call, and she was, again, it was that same type of mentality. Well, I'm just going to push through it. And I said, I only fasted 14 hours yesterday because I did a leg workout and I was really, really, really hungry. And I said,
Mm.
okay, I'm going to eat. I'm going to break my
Yeah.
fast. She was shocked.
Your body needs food, it needs fuel, needs to recover. But it's amazing when, like, people who have been fasting, like I talked to Karen, who was, under the supervision of gurus, like fasting for 28 days and just stalled out and wasn't losing weight and, like I say, low energy. But once they start dialing in what they eat,
Mm-hmm.
everything just, once they get the body gets the nutrients it needs, it's like it says, there's no famine, there's no emergency, there's no, food's good here. I don't need to hold all this emergency fat. I can let it go, and it just falls into place a whole lot better. So that's a really wonderful thing that we keep on seeing as people then they dial in using their blood sugars, what they eat and when they eat. And once they get that balance right, a lot of things fall into place, even for the older women and who have struggled for a long time with that extended fasting mentality.
Well, and I think we really do our patients a disservice if we are still stuck in that kind of old mentality that it's calories in, calories out, which I know completely gets you hot under the collar as it does myself, because I said you're completely negating another aspect, all of this. But you can appreciate why patients will struggle, because it's very new for them to have a concept where they are like, I only eat when I'm hungry. And when I get hungry, I check my blood sugar. And if I know my blood sugar is within this healthy range, then I break my fast. But if it's 110, I still have fuel to burn. And so that whole kind of concept, I think, is so empowering for people. It was interesting. There was a well-known vegan cardiologist on Twitter who was poo-pooing Peter Attia and his supportive continuous glucose monitors. And so I normally am not like this on social media, but I was like, I get tired of the arrogance that I see. And I'm not going to just say it's physicians. I'm going to say healthcare providers that aren't willing to entertain the possibility that having a little bit of biohacking assistance, whether it's a glucometer or CPM, can help empower your patients to say, maybe, for that 55-year-old woman who's never entertained the possibility that, she has at her disposal the ability to really mitigate what's going on. Let's fuel your body with, high quality protein and healthy fats and high quality carbohydrates. And let's find out when you run out of fuel, like literally when your body's run out of gas, that's when you fill up the tank. Not, reflexively, this is what I want to do. But, you touched on one thing that I want to make sure I touch on as well, because the OMAD piece, there are a lot of women that want to do OMAD all the time. They're like, I'm only hungry for one meal and I want to do OMAD. And I said, OMAD is fine if you are away on vacation, maybe you overindulged, you're going to have one meal and you're going to get back on track the following day. But sustained OMAD for women, very hard for people to get enough macros in during that piece. And I know, when I was interviewing Ted, and I know you interviewed Ted Naiman as well, probably a couple times.
Great, mate.
And he's absolutely brilliant. And so we were having a sidebar conversation. And I was saying, the whole concept of prolonged fast for thinner people who are maybe body composition wise almost at their goal or at their goal. I don't know the return. There's like a law of diminishing returns at that point. Like really trying to decide how much more are you going to squeeze out of that dish rag? Like how much more are you going to get out of that? Is it really worth putting your body through that extra stress? And so I know even Maria Emmerich and I had a conversation about this as well, that not going overboard with really long fasts. I know people think, if a little bit of autophagy is good, then a whole lot more is better. And so
I'll get all that autophagy in 7 days because I'm going to fast longer for harder and longer for harder. And then it's really hard to control what you eat at the end of
Yeah.
that fast. You're not going, give me the chicken breast and egg white and protein powder. You're going, I want that fat bomb. I want the donut. I want,
Yeah.
I want the cream and the peanut butter and all the energy dense foods. And that's the problem we see is it's just hard to get enough protein, enough nutrients in when you refeed to maintain your lean muscle mass, which is so, like you mentioned before, incredibly important to metabolic health, especially as you age.
Yeah. Well, it's that whole slippery slope of osteopenia, sarcopenia, all these fun things that happen if we aren't working very diligently to reverse them. And I think that this is another aspect of what differentiates men from women is that we tend to have more body fat on our bodies. Again, it's a byproduct of procreation and being able to conceive and carry a child. We are much more sensitive to the changes that occur in skeletal muscle, and muscles are the organ of longevity. Maintain as much lean muscle as possible. And, Gabrielle Line always talks about muscle being glucose reservoirs for food. So I remind people, I'm like, you want to do everything you can. Like, don't skip, you don't want to skip a leg day. You don't want to skip a body weight exercise day. You want to maintain as much lean muscle, because I see a lot of women, I can see some thinner women in their 50s, 60s and beyond, and they look their muscles almost like sinewy. They look very estrogen deficient and frail. And I think so many of us don't want to end up looking that way. So how do you have this happy medium? And a lot of it focuses on maintaining as much lean muscle mass as you can.
There's a crazy amount of confusion out there over, avoiding protein and mTOR and IGF-1, and it just gets a myriad of messed up thoughts that here I am fasting, losing lean muscle mass, refeeding with high-fat keto foods when I refeed, and people just lose their metabolic reservoir of muscle that will enable them to burn the energy they eat. So they have to keep on cutting down further and further and further and basically wasting away. And then once you get to that point, you're frail, you're old, you've lost your muscle mass. It's just such a risky point to get to that you're going to fall over, break a hip, and nothing good happens after that point. I think Peter Attia said that 50% of people who break a hip never leave the hospital system afterwards. It's just a crazy risk of being old and frail, and you have to make that investment from your 30s, 40s, 50s. So when you get to 70, 80, you can keep living till 90 and being independent. And that's so, anytime I see old people in the nursing home, it's just like that once they lose the independence, it's scary. It's not a life you want to live if you you can't toilet, you can't eat. It's just, but if you can live I love, Tommy Wood talks about the grandmother hypothesis, that if you can invest in your community and you're giving back to your community for as long as you can, your body says, I'm needed here. I need to live longer. I need to regenerate. But if you're not able to contribute to the society around you, then your body says, okay, time to shut down. I'm wasting resources effectively. So that's, I just want to be involved and appreciated by as many people as I can for as long as I can, because I know that'll make my body want to live for a long time. So,
well, and it's interesting because my whole background as an NP is in cardiology, so I was able to see people from their 20s all the way up to we even had patients in their 90s and early 100s, and the patients that fared the best in middle age and beyond were the ones that still felt vital and needed, much to your point. And I used to love seeing, very active people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, the ones who still volunteered at the senior center or the hospital. And they loved it. They said, I take my volunteer job as seriously as I did my, job I got paid for years ago. And much to your point about maintaining your ability, all the body mechanic works, being able to get off the toilet, being able to push and pull things, go to the grocery store. There's nothing worse. I have a parent who retired early from the federal government, and my dad went from being super vital and smart to,
Mm.
I watched him just really cognitively decline because he needed that stimulation. He didn't realize, I
Mm.
think he thought the idea of an early retirement sounded grand because he could
Gonna
travel.
play golf every day.
Right. But, looking at how frail my father is compared to my mom, who's super active, just really reinforces why, we want to maintain. And something interesting that a colleague of mine, a GYN, mentioned to me yesterday. So we're learning more and more and more about these synthetic hormones that women are
Mm.
given, oftentimes from their teenage years up until when they want to get pregnant in their 30s. And so they have this loss of, so when you're on oral contraceptives, you have this loss of estrogen, and estrogen signaling in the brain, and how you lose out on opportunities to build bone. So
Mm.
you have this
Wow.
loss of bone building in our peak bone building years, which are 20s and 30s. And so we're having this conversation. I said, how many women do we know, including ourselves, that were on oral contraceptives for years and years and years? And then maybe you go off contraceptives, you have a couple pregnancies, and you decide you're done having babies, and then you move on to the next phase, and you think like, I missed out on all that bone building time
Yeah.
and didn't realize it. So I think that certainly younger generations are going to benefit from, like, my generation that's starting to question a lot of kind of the mindset of, let's prevent pregnancy and then we'll worry about the sequelae that comes from that, down the road. There's so many more options for women now, which I think is great.
Mm.
But just in tying into that muscle and bone loss piece,
Mm.
certainly very important that we're as proactive as possible about maintaining
Mm.
that. And what's interesting is, someone asked me the other day about, is there any correlation between fasting and bone loss?
Mm.
So, I've done a little bit of research, and I think a lot of it can play into menopausal women with low estradiol and
Wow.
low insulin related to fasting that could potentially, but you start to look at all the other factors. And I'm sure even as an engineer, you kind of dive into
Mm.
the research. I think there's a lot of factors that can impact that. But if you're someone that's been, borderline eating disorder your entire life, very
Mm.
focused on the weight piece, probably not building much bone in your 20s and 30s, and then getting into, perimenopause and menopause, and with this loss ultimately of estradiol or estrogen
Mm.
signaling, and loss of progesterone, that can definitely impact osteoblasts and osteoclastic
Mm.
activity in the bones themselves. So it's like
Yeah.
diving down a rabbit hole of goodness. I always say there's, someone will ask a question and then, I'll come out a day later and I'm like, wow, that was cool.
That's fascinating. Yeah, calcium's important, but definitely protein is also incredibly important,
Yep.
along with all the other nutrients to building healthy bones and being able to resistance train you to put
Yep.
those stresses on your muscles and your bones to make sure that they're strong. So you've just got, I see myself, I'm 45, and what I hold now is my investment for the future till I'm not going to be a Dave Asprey and say I'm going to live to 120, but
Every
you
time I
know,
say that, I'm like, that's a little crazy, Dave. I think after, working with a large patient population, I think 80, if I get to 85, that's good. Like 85 appeared to be a pretty good age. Like, I felt like people still had a good quality of life, and then,
mm,
it's the law of diminishing returns after that. But I don't think I want to be that
yeah.
old when I die.
Yeah, it's definitely all about health span rather than lifespan. But if you've got your health dialed in early, you've got a better chance of having a better lifespan and health span.
Mhm.
Um, so, I'm obviously not female, but I've got a wife who's hooked up to a continuous glucose monitor and now a continuous, I can see her insulin pump
Mhm.
daily and monthly, and I monitor that every 3 days. I'll update her basal profile based on what it's been doing for the last week and month. And I find it completely fascinating. And, what I noticed was that leading up to that time of the month, when the cravings happen and emotions go a little bit askew sometimes, and, the insulin levels rise, the insulin requirements rise, the blood sugars rise, and then afterwards they drop again. Sometimes they plummet, maybe not so much as she's getting to the same age as me. But yeah, just maybe unpack what's happening there. And in data-driven fasting, we definitely guide people during that premenstrual period to be able to understand that, yeah, you're elevated, your blood sugars are going to be elevated, your insulin's going to be elevated during that period, your cravings are going to be a little bit weird, and maybe that's okay. And how do people understand that without diving too deep down the rabbit hole? It's a fascinating area, but
Yeah.
and unfortunately fairly limited understanding.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure that's not the case, but yes. So, the first day of our menstrual cycle is, day one, and we know that estrogen predominates in the first half of the menstrual cycle itself. So let's just say the cycle itself is 28 days, just for argument's sake. So days 1 through 14 really predominate. Estrogen predominates. This is oftentimes when people feel their best. They may bleed for the first 4 or 5 days of that cycle, and then it stops. Really leading up to ovulation. And this is when people oftentimes can fast a little longer. They may not have as many cravings. They may not feel quite as bloated. And it's all working up to ovulation. And ovulation is obviously, the body is preparing itself for the release of an egg. In the best case scenario, release the egg somewhere between day 14, 15, 16, depending on the individual. Some people are aware when this happens. And during the second half of our menstrual cycle, we have this other hormone, progesterone. And progesterone is, we always call it the chill out hormone. It's the hormone that's designed to make us more relaxed. It may make us a little bit bloated. It may make us a little bit constipated. And we know the 5 to 7 days preceding when our menstrual cycle should occur. This is when I will say to people that you will notice there are some insulin changes. If you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor, you may notice your numbers bump up a little bit. This increased degree of insulin sensitivity and specificity. It's when I will oftentimes suggest to people, if you're going low carb, this might be the time to have a slightly larger portion. This might be what helps satisfy you. Women will say they crave magnesium or they crave dark chocolate. What they're really craving is magnesium. I know with your chronometer, you're very focused in on the nutrient. And so this is oftentimes when I'll see, I'll say maybe a slightly larger portion of sweet potato or squash if you tolerate grains, really kind of diving into that. And it's like 150 more calories a day. We're not talking about a third meal or a fourth meal. That's really not what we're talking about. We can also see some sleep disturbances. Sometimes people will see like looser bowels. They may have diarrhea or looser stools. And so, really kind of leading up until, if there is not an egg that's been fertilized, your body's kind of have this peak of progesterone. And then as progesterone starts to fall, you're getting closer and closer to when menstruation begins. And so what I oftentimes find, and this has been my anecdotal evidence of working with thousands of women feel pretty good for the first 14 days of their cycle. After ovulation, still probably, so the first 3 weeks, they're feeling pretty good. They can usually push the envelope. If they're not new to intermittent fasting, they can push the envelope on hours and strategies. If they want to do a bone broth fast, if they're, looking to do different types of fasting. And I'm sure that you probably talk about a lot of the different types of fasting that's available beyond just water or green tea or black coffee. And so being able to push that a little bit more, I do find that one of the questions that I get oftentimes is, should I be eating foods that are helping my body prepare itself for ovulation? Should I be eating foods that are helping to package up extra estrogen in the body? There's always these concerns that we've got too much extra circulating hormones. And I oftentimes remind people, like, let's not just guess, let's test. But as an example, in the first 14 days, this is a time when you can have a lot of, cruciferous vegetables. So we're talking about like broccoli and cauliflower and kale, if you tolerate, kind of an oxalate sensitive, if you're not an oxalate sensitive individual, because we know that this can help package up excess estrogen that can be excreted in our stool. Definitely something to think about. There aren't any per se progesterone supportive foods that I've been able to find. I mean, I haven't seen any research to suggest this, whereas we definitely have some foods that we know that can be very supportive of estrogen in the first half of the menstrual cycle. So second half of the menstrual cycle, if your egg is not fertilized, your body is preparing for, shedding the endometrial lining and then beginning a new cycle. And what I find is most people that are eating a fairly nutrient dense diet, not eating 24/7, and maybe you're really just doing 12 or 13 hours fast. It's really just a digestive rest those few days before your cycle. They have less PMS. They have less food cravings. They sleep better. They have more energy. And so I don't think it's any any surprise that when we're eating more nutrient dense foods and we're eating less often, that our body can actually do the things it's designed to do in a way that makes it much more amenable to ensuring that we feel good. I mean, I think we've kind of gotten conditioned that everyone has terrible premenstrual syndrome and that we're just going to, the week preceding our cycle, we're just going to kind of throw all of our hard work away and say, I'm going to indulge every salty, sweet, junkified food craving that I have. And I'm just going to get back on track when my period starts, when I feel a whole lot better. And so that's kind of a very, very basic. I don't know if you want me to dive deeper into the physiology that goes on, or if that's more than what you were kind of looking for.
No, that might be more of a deep dive for another time. But so why does weight? That's one thing people notice, is that weight increases in that premenstrual phase. Why do people hold on to weight more, and how do they manage that? How do they conceptualize that? I suppose they just have to say that does happen, and after, when the period comes, my blood sugars will drop, my insulin will drop, and you'll flush water from the system and the weight will drop, and you don't get too hung up on that in that premenstrual phase.
Yeah, well, I usually recommend not weighing yourself every single day and recognizing that this is a byproduct of hormonal fluctuations. Our weight may fluctuate by 2 to 3 pounds day to day. It could be from the byproduct of progesterone, which is a hormone in the body that will cause us to retain some fluid, not so that we feel miserably uncomfortable, but that alone can be a byproduct. Certainly if we're dehydrated, if we're not having a bowel movement every day. I mean, I have had women that do not have bowel movements every day. And when we get them going every single day, all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, I had, 2 or 3 days worth of poop sitting in my bowel, and that could have definitely been contributing. So I just like to remind people that fluid retention can absolutely cause you to hold. I mean, I always feel bloated right before my period. I mean, that is a given, and that's how I think most people feel. But it's usually a byproduct of progesterone's influences. And progesterone is designed to be this mellow hormone. It's designed to, help nourish the body in the event that we have an egg that is fertilized, and the growing potential growing endometrium. So I just remind people that we know there's this 1 week out of our cycle that we are probably going to feel a little bit of bloat. We may feel it just around our abdomens. We may feel like our bowels slow down. So being really diligent about hydration, having 2 green salads a day, crushing up flaxseed and chia seeds and putting them in a smoothie. I'm a huge fan of gallbladder supportive foods. So things like shaved beets, carrots, artichokes can all help with, keeping the bile. And this is something tangential, but I find that coming out of the non-fat, low-fat years, we'll have a lot of viscous bile. And so bile is a substance that helps us break down and emulsify fat. And so if someone starts going higher fat in their intake or consuming more fats, and their digestion slows down, oftentimes like what happens around a woman's menstrual cycle, I just remind them that we want to be really diligent about doing a lot of bile supportive properties. And I always say starting with food. So shaved beets is a great thing. In fact, I eat beets every single day because they're just so good for detoxification in our gallbladders, but also adding in things like, it doesn't taste good, but aloe vera juice, like even a small amount, if people are struggling with constipation around their cycle, you can do like a 1/4 cup. It doesn't taste great, but it's very effective. Got all sorts of things, but usually fresh ground flax and chia seeds together, like a tablespoon or a teaspoon of each, can really get things moving along, like in a very benign way, or eating green salads to kind of keep things moving forward. But the hydration, the bile supportive foods, making sure you're getting plenty of physical activity. If you're a couch potato and you're dehydrated, you're not going to be feeling great around your cycle. And so
PMS is going to be bad. Yes. So you're sort of saying if you're eating well, if you're active, if you're drinking enough water, you're not going to have as excessive PMS symptoms that are going to drive you to crave those bad foods that often derail the whole process.
And I think it's also critically important that if you have a trigger food, don't keep it in your house. I have teenage boys.
It'll be gone during that week.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have teenage boys, and certainly for them, there are foods in the house I don't eat at all. and I just I don't like the way I feel when I eat them, so I don't eat them at all. It's not even a temptation. But
Mm.
I think that if there are foods, like if your kryptonite are cookies, don't buy cookies. Don't buy cookie mix. Don't buy the stuff for cookies. Just don't even tempt yourself. But find an alternative. I think
Mm.
dark chocolate for a lot of people, if you get really high quality dark chocolate, you'll get that magnesium fix and
Mm.
you're not going to derail your diet. But I
Mm.
feel like you can't control yourself. If you have that, I think it's Glenn Livingston calls it Lizzie. If the lizard
Mm.
brain goes overboard, or the pig, I think
Yeah.
it refers to as the pig,
Yeah. Yeah.
call
Yeah.
it Lizzie. But you get that overdrive. It's like, let's make sure that you're structuring your meals so that you've got protein and healthy fats so that you're not feeling like you're not satiated. Because the satiety piece, which I know you talk a lot about,
Mm.
is critically important. I think not enough healthcare professionals talk about that with their patients. And it's like you're setting yourself up for failure if you're just focusing on, like, I have to have fat bombs. I'm like, no, I'd actually rather that you have a scoop of nut butter and have that with, that's what you want. If that's what's going to help you at the end of a meal, you have a scoop of nut butter and or coconut butter, or
Mm.
scoop of NCT oil, and that's going to keep you satisfied and obviously not destroying your macros, but
Mm.
keeping you satiated at the end of a meal so you're not looking for other stuff to fill yourself up can really be very helpful.
Yeah, but you've got to prioritize good food first and lead with that, and then sort of, you know, when you look at the protein leverage hypothesis, basically all animals chase protein and nutrients first, and then top up with the energy that they need to get through the day. And I think that's a really wise way to approach it. Yeah, so you're a big fan of protein and Gabriel Lion and building muscle. And so what do you do in terms of eating to maximize your health, your metabolic health, your strength for future aging?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I get really good quality sleep. So I think everything starts with sleep because you get, these, as I'm sure you probably talk about, these spikes of human growth hormone in the
Mm.
night. So you don't want to lose out on that. So sleep first. And then, you got to put enough strain on your muscles to make them grow. So I couldn't like go to the gym and be lifting 10 pounds. I mean, that's not going to do it. So I really endeavor to push myself and to do
Mm.
leg day like twice a week. And then I'll break out 2 other days as I can do them. But yes, the protein thing for me is really critical. My family thinks I'm just a gigantic dork because a lot of what I do is I'll have a meal focused around a piece of meat. I'm a huge fan of bison.
Wow.
We eat quite a bit of beef. I recently tried elk, which I really enjoyed.
Cool.
Um, I would
A lot
say,
of the game meats tend to be leaner and higher protein, which is a real good hack. We have kangaroo here, so I try to prioritize that. And then later in the day, I'm craving the fats and carbs, but I know at least I've got the protein in first.
yep. So trying to make sure that we get varied amounts of protein. I mean, I used to be a big fish person, but I have to be completely honest. The more I read about the toxins and pollutants that are in, farmed fish,
Mm.
I really think of fish as something I don't eat all that often, and I
Mm.
really prioritize quality. So I want it to be wild, but I really like salmon. I do enjoy tuna on occasion,
Mm.
although again, I try to just avoid the predatory fish, but we'll have shrimp. My kids like shrimp. My kids are really big carnivores. I mean, they preferentially, the amount of meat that we cook every week is just astronomical. And so focus on protein. And then for me, what's really important is I really like salad. I went through a period of
Yep.
time after a long hospitalization in 2019. I couldn't eat vegetables for probably 9 months at all, and they had to be cooked. So I try to eat salad, at least like a big salad, at least once a day. So vegetables are really important for me. That's just what makes my body feel good.
Mm.
And when I have everything really well balanced, I don't have cravings. I would say my one vice right now is I love salted macadamia nuts. There's something about the salt and the nut. And so I will measure out a quarter cup and I really will stick to that.
Yep.
And like maybe a piece of really good quality dark chocolate, but I try not to do that all that often because it's so easy, as you know,
Mm.
over
Mm.
nuts, so easy.
Yeah.
So easy.
Especially if you don't prioritize the good food up front. Yeah, interesting with the salad, the non-starchy green veggies will definitely give you the nutrients, the magnesium, the potassium that we all struggle to get. That they contain fiber and bulk and water and from a satiety point of view, are really good. They don't provide a lot of calories, but
Yeah.
they just sort of supplement the
Yeah.
protein, so you're more full and satiated. And yeah, that's really fascinating. So in terms of thyroid, I know that's a massive rabbit hole that a lot of people in the group wanted to know. From my point of view, there's sort of a interplay between obesity and your thyroid, and if if you're holding a lot of weight, basically your metabolism tries to ramp up to burn off that weight. But if as you drop your weight, your thyroid will reduce function, and because you don't need to burn off as much weight. And your metabolism as you lose weight does actually slow, and a lot of people find they need less thyroid meds, and it's generally a good news story. Just as you lose weight, you need less thyroid stimulation. But how much is, which one goes first, the dysfunctional thyroid or the obesity? And it's sort of a chicken and the egg scenario in some ways, and a lot of people like to blame their thyroid for their obesity, but in some ways it's the other way around. And I don't know, it's a deep rabbit hole to unpack and lots of controversy out there, but be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think for women, especially women over the age of 35, it's been my experience that the changes in sex hormones start to mitigate and exacerbate thyroid issues. So, for example, progesterone and thyroid hormone really do fit together, in terms of very complementary of one another. And one of the first things that starts to happen is women are heading into perimenopause. So, like late 30s, early 40s, you're there. You have less progesterone because we're born with a finite amount of eggs. We're not like men where we're reproducing sperm every 3 days. And so one of the first things that starts to happen is we have this relative estrogen dominance because we have less circulating progesterone because our eggs are as old as we are. So this is when I start to see this push-pull. I think it's multifactorial. I think there are multiple things that happen. I think, as women are getting older, it's the piece of, the mentality of I have to exercise harder, which raises cortisol, which can stress the adrenals, and the adrenals become this backup system for progesterone production when the ovaries are starting to kind of falter and I hate to use the word wither, but they're just not as vibrant as they were at 25. And so we have this, that's one avenue that things go down. I think the inflammatory nature of our diets, also the inflammatory pathway will drive some thyroid stress, but also create inflammation in the body and inflammaging. I also think about, if you've got this relative estrogen dominance and you've got this, undervalued progesterone levels as we're getting closer and closer to menopause. I think I always think about our sex hormones, our adrenals, and our thyroid as a three-legged stool. And if one leg is loose or not as strong, it impacts all of them. I think about, there's so many things that impact healthy thyroid function, gut health, food sensitivities, nutrient deficiencies. I talk a lot about this.
Yeah, I'd love you to talk more about the foods and nutrients to stimulate your thyroid function.
Yeah, so I think about iron and selenium and iodine. Iodine, I know, is very controversial. I actually just interviewed Dr. Alan Christensen, who feels that the reason why there's so much thyroid disease is from the sources of iodine that we're getting through our personal care products and food and our environment. So I still talk about iodine, although I'm not 100% sorry. This is the problem of having like an iMac. Everything is coordinated. Sometimes the calls pop up. But I start thinking about nutrient deficiencies. I think about toxins that we're exposed to that can impact and offset thyroid receptors, heavy metals. And this is not woo-woo. I personally, in my early 40s, I've never had a mercury amalgam, but my mom, when she was pregnant with me, had a mouthful of mercury fillings because that's just what people did in the 50s. They filled their mouths with mercury. And so when I was in my 40s and they actually were trying to figure out why my thyroid went south, the first thing they said was, your mercury levels are ridiculously high. We think it's related to these three factors, one of them being your mom's exposure to mercury. So when we think about what impacts thyroid function, it's the entire endocrine system and then all the other things that I noted. So it really requires a bit of savvy unpacking. Now, what I can tell you is the bulk of people that develop thyroid issues are related to autoimmune issues like Hashimoto's. So 80 to 85% of people who develop an underactive thyroid, it's related to an autoimmune reaction in the body. This is no surprise given the, gut health issues that are rampant between stress and poor quality sleep and our poor quality of food and, fluctuating yo-yo dieting, all these things that can put the stressor. So it is a rabbit hole. I could literally talk
very,
about,
very deep rabbit hole.
I could literally talk about probably each one of those things, but is it at all uncommon for women to become hypothyroid in their 40s? Absolutely not. Do I see it grossly undertreated? Yes, largely because people aren't doing the right tests, and the right tests are more than one or two. So if someone's listening and saying, how do I figure out what the right tests are? It generally involves more than just thyroid function tests. It's looking at iron, it's looking at heavy metals, looking at those sex hormones, which I know is not super sexy. There are a lot of people who want to dig their head in the sand and say, no, it's not possible. I can't possibly have low progesterone and then ultimately low estradiol and the low testosterone and how all those things. I always say the endocrine system, which is our hormone system in our body, is so interlaced and intertwined with one another that one hormone begets another hormone, meaning that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's no way that you're not going to have an imbalance in thyroid hormone that isn't going to have a downward effect elsewhere in your body. And for anyone to think it's just you just need thyroid replacement, it's not that easy.
Yeah, totally.
It's really not
You can't just replace one hormone in your body to manage the symptom because it's such a complex system. So beyond diving into deep nutritional testing and trying to work out all the moving parts, what are the most common solutions that people can do to manage those symptoms or even mitigate preemptively those situations?
Are we talking specifically about thyroid?
Generally about thyroid, but what are the big levers? I suppose you just go back to good sleep, working out, being strong, good nutrition, and that's what everybody can do potentially.
Well, and I think I wish I knew now. I wish I knew 20 years ago or even 10 years ago what I know now, because I remember in my 30s taking care of women in their 40s and 50s who I thought were crazy. No, I realize they're not crazy. It's that no one talks to them about what starts happening to their bodies until they slap a bunch of hormones on. But preemptively, the things I think about that I wish I had known was really good quality sleep, 7-8 hours a night of high quality sleep, cold, dark room. If you're on electronics, like right now, I'm sitting, bathed in blue light. We both are. We know that it has this, untoward effect on melatonin secretion in our brains. For you is good because you're starting your day. For me, not quite as good, but I will put the blockers on because we want to mitigate the disruption of melatonin secretion at night. We want our bodies, we have these clocks throughout our body that are responsive to melatonin. It's not just a sleep hormone. There's so much more to it than that. So high quality sleep, plenty of it, 7-8 hours a night of sleep. I know everyone wants to stay up late when their kids go to bed when they're younger. I get it. Now my kids stay up later than me, which is a whole separate issue.
Yeah, totally. I used to put the kids to bed, but now I go to bed at the same time and they stay up late. But anyway.
Oh yeah, they just wait us out. Stress management, and this is more than just saying I practice stress management. We were talking about the Apollo Neuro, I think about meditation. Really important that we're proactively thinking about sleep and stress management when we get up in the morning, exposure to light in the morning, also very important. And balancing stress means not over exercising. And so this is the common misnomer is that women, our mentality is I need to exercise harder to lose weight. So, they won't just do 2 hours of cardio. They're going to do 3. They're going to stay on that treadmill. I see women, they look haggard in my neighborhood that I know were about the same age or they're around my age. Yeah. I think the elevated cortisol from that much stress on their body at that point in time is not a good thing. So, lifting.
And then your body craves all those comfort foods because the metabolism is just going to give me more energy because you put me through all that pain. And that's why just punctuated resistance training that doesn't drive you to rebound binge is probably a better approach, and gentle walking is a really nice approach as well.
Oh yeah. Well, I was going to say my trifecta is strength training. I walk a lot. So how do you get in 17,000 steps a day? And I was like, well, I walk. I have 2 dogs. And during COVID, one of the few things I could do was walk. I couldn't go to the gym. So I walk quite a bit, and I enjoy walking outside. And then I do a lot of core work. So I do a exercise called solid core.
Yep.
It's very intense. It's like Pilates on steroids. And that's just what doesn't overtax my body in any capacity. I enjoy all these things, and really checking in with yourself and noting, when you exercise, do you feel like you have more energy or less? What I find is when women admit to themselves, or men for that matter, that they feel depleted after exercise, that's a sign that you either didn't fuel your body properly or you're over exercising. So definitely the exercise piece and the nutrition piece is really critical. I tell people it all starts with food. People think because in their 20s and 30s they got away with eating garbage diets that they can continue doing that. I hate to burst the bubble. I'm here to tell you, in middle age, it changes. You can't just eat anything. And so not only is it, prioritizing protein, as I know you talk about quite a bit, but it's also removing inflammatory foods. Like I stopped eating gluten 9 years ago. I stopped eating dairy 3 years ago. I'm largely grain free, except for some ancient grains and very occasionally. But I think it's being honest with yourself about what serves you or no longer serves you. For me, when I pulled out dairy, it was like the 5 pounds I couldn't seem to get rid of.
Wow.
Perimenopause, I lost just from, the rare raw cheese I was eating, and maybe occasionally some yogurt. So I think that you'd have to get really honest with yourself. And for me, I think it's more about, how do I feel? Like that's always the check-in point. How do I feel when I make these choices? Because if I feel good, it doesn't feel like a hardship. And that's the point that I think a lot of people have to get to, because the thought of pulling things out of their diet is frightening, because they're so emotionally tied or connected to the foods that they're eating, or they eat for pleasure, which food is meant to be pleasurable. But if you're eating for emotional reasons associated with the food as well, you have to find other ways to self-soothe. And sometimes with clients, I'll tell them, okay, go take a walk, go brush your teeth. Find meals, like when you feel a craving come on that is not legitimate because you've already had a good dinner, you had a good lunch, you slept really well. The question is, where are you in your cycle? If you're not cycling anymore, then you need a distraction, and maybe it's the time to do something else. You say to yourself, I'm going to set a timer for 15 minutes, and I bet by the time that timer goes off, I'm not going to be thinking about that food anymore. And so
a lot of people try to fill that dopamine hole that isn't satisfied in other parts of their life, with their relationships or their work, with food, and just have to reorientate that the dopamine hit. Just quickly, I know you're on social media a lot, potentially as as an influencer and out there with a podcast and Facebook groups. How do you manage the overwhelm from social media and just making sure you don't get caught up in that to the point that it interrupts your sleep and your dopamine cycles and everything else? That's an issue a lot of people face these days.
Yeah, that's a great question. For full transparency, I have a team. So I pay a team to be where I cannot be 24/7. I have very firm boundaries about when I check in on social media. I actually find Twitter to be the most enjoyable platform that I'm on, but I have to be careful because I can be in a rabbit hole where I'm just, wanting to be on there. And then I'm like, okay, I need to check myself. This is not healthy. So I think it really involves, like, I have team members that make it look like I'm everywhere. Although when I say I'm really somewhere, if you're sending me messages on Instagram, it really is me responding to DMs, not my team. But I think I don't know if it's a generational thing, but I'm the nerdy person that carries a book everywhere I go. So for example, today I got my hair colored. And so the woman who does my hair knows I'm going to come with a book, because I always tell her I need to take an hour away from social media and off my phone. And so I'll just sit there and read. And I'm like, I don't care if I just get through a chapter, but, really setting firm boundaries. And then the other thing is I kind of effectively shut my brain off at night. So I'm not worried about what's going on social media. I don't like to be controversial. I don't like to argue. It's not that I don't disagree. And it's not that I don't desire intellectual interaction. But as a rule, like, I don't use my social media platform as one to be divisive. It's meant to be inspiring, educational, and innovative. And so much like your voice on social media is very positive. So I think that definitely saves me from drama. Like, I have colleagues that like being controversial and like stirring the pot. And I'm like, I don't have the bandwidth for that. I know myself well enough to know like that's not going to serve me well. So much to your
Yeah.
point about, feeling like you're tethered to something on social media. There's very little that I feel like can't sit and wait. I try to interact with people and treat them the way that I try to kind of ensure that I'm treating people the way I want to be treated. So, for example, I have a private Facebook group, and there was someone in there who I think was coming from a good place, but we were talking about a researcher, and this researcher is vegetarian, and this individual was frustrated that this individual was putting out all this research but was vegetarian because it was giving a slant. And I said, well, I think it's okay to disagree. Not everyone is going to align with my philosophies on animal protein. And I said, I frankly don't think I would feel or look the way that I do at my age if I were only eating plant-based protein, but I'm not going to judge people that choose to. And this person she was going to die on that sword. And I told my team, I said, I'm going to make the last response and then we're shutting the comments down because it's no longer helpful. It's now becoming argumentative. And I said, if you feel that strongly, send a letter to the person who wrote the book and let them know. I mean, not sure if they'll ever read it, but maybe you'll feel better.
Yeah, it's a crazy world out there, and you can't correct everybody who you think is wrong on Facebook,
Right.
and you just go insane trying to do that. And I find sometimes those conflicts can be teaching opportunities just to show here's another option. Have you thought of this, and guide people through it. So, what are you excited about for the future? You've got a book coming out on women's hormones and intermittent fasting, ironically. So you're mentioning before.
Yeah, no. So right now next week we are heading into our first of 2 moves. We've been building a house since last September, and it's taken a heck of a lot longer than we thought. So we are moving from one rental to another. We sold our house in Washington, D.C. in one day and thought we would just be in this rental for 6 months. And now we're on 9 months and continuing on. So the short term, 2 more moves. And then the book will be coming out. It's on women and intermittent fasting, will be coming out in early 2022, which is exciting. I would say beyond that, I'm excited to actually be doing in-person talks. Like I just had my first one in Montana about 2 weeks ago, and my speaker stuff is starting to really fill up. I was telling my husband I'm getting a little nervous because there's a lot of back-to-back, we may be doing a lot of traveling to be able to attend all these events, but I'm excited to be able to be back in person, excited to be back in front of an audience. It's something I really genuinely love and feel very passionate about. And then also really growing the podcast. And I feel really fortunate to have been able to connect with amazing people like yourself this year, to feel inspired to reach out and say, hey, I love this really fresh take on fasting. I think this is going to change things for a lot of people. And I definitely want to make sure people can connect with you and be able to share the great work you're doing. So I would say, growing the podcast, continuing to do that. I've been surprised at how much I've enjoyed that. I actually enjoy interviewing people more than I could have ever imagined, especially as an introvert. And, just having the ability to have a platform to share really great information and to do it in a way, much like you do, where it's designed to be really helpful and positive and uplifting, because there's plenty of divisiveness that's out there. I just don't want to be a part of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely been a wonderful way just to meet people and get to chat to people and develop relationships with people. And I love podcasts. I'm driving all the time, and in the gym I'm listening to podcasts. So it's just a great way to take in information that most people these days don't want to sit down and read the latest 2,000 word blog post. They'd rather absorb it through these conversations. Yeah. So thank you. This has been fantastic, and you've absolutely nailed all the topics that people wanted us to cover. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward. Hope the move goes really well, and look forward to the continued friendship.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Cynthia.